Most business owners say that they need more leads when in reality they don't. More leads would probably break their business, and before they start putting more leads into their business, they need a better system in order to sell those leads, because otherwise they'll be spending more money, putting more effort in, and getting nothing on the back end. If I wanted to make my sales process incredibly scalable, these are the steps that I would take in order to do that. It would mean that my sales process wouldn't rely on me, it wouldn't rely on luck, and it wouldn't be dependent on one single person. If a team member steps away, the process still runs, because when business is very much reliant on one person, we have a very risky model at play. Now, before we look at building out the automations for a sales process, the first step is us actually having a proper tracking system in place, because it's impossible to scale a sales team unless we know where the calls are coming from and where the sales are coming from, most importantly. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to get incredibly accurate with our data, and the way that we do that is we use UTM tracking links. So what essentially a UTM tracking link is it's a piece of code that goes at the end of a URL. So we have a URL here. This is a lead magnet that we run about launching your first ad campaign using our 3-step ad launch system. We're running this on paid ads at the minute, so you'll then see that what the campaign source is down as is paid ads. The medium is we're running it on Meta. The campaign is our 3-step ad launch system. The audience that we're running it in is US abroad audience, and then it was ad 3, this example. So then what we'll find from an ad point of view is we then have a different UTM link for each ad, for ad 1, for ad 2, for ad 3, for ad 4, etc., etc. If we then do a UK audience for a UK, if we do an Australian audience for an Australian audience. And then that means that it's very easy for us to then exactly see where each lead comes from. So what we then need to do on our forms, we then basically add hidden fields. Those hidden fields is a hidden campaign source, hidden campaign medium, hidden campaign name, campaign term, and campaign content, which I'll show you now. So you'll then see here, what we've done is we've added hidden fields. A hidden field here that you'll see is the UTM term, a hidden field for campaign, a hidden field for medium, etc., etc. Essentially all of the steps that we have here. It doesn't matter which order they're added to, but they do need to follow this sort of framework. So we have a naming key for UTM term, UTM campaign, UTM medium, UTM source, and then UTM content. What this then means is when we create this UTM link, we put in the link to the URL, we put in the source, the medium, the name, the term, the content, we then use this specific link. That then means that anytime someone goes through that link that has this form on, it will then save this specific data into the appropriate UTM fields. From then a tracking perspective, we can then always backdate granularly from which specific campaign, which specific audience, which specific ad within that audience, or even down to which specific email sequence and email within an email sequence that call booking has come from. It then also means we can then backdate any sales and see exactly which is correlated to the most sales, so we can do more of that thing instead of less of what's actually making us money. Most businesses are miles away from actually being ready to scale, and having simple systems like this in place, it will allow you to get far more specific with your data. As a result, you'll be able to scale off of far less ad spend and sign more clients with less money in, and as a result, you'll have a bigger ROI, a bigger margin on the back end, purely down to something simple like this using UTM links. So you can go to this URL here, and then you can create your UTM link, and then this is the link that you'd link inside your ads. However, you're probably then going to say in ads it's fine, but if you're going to link this in your bio, if you're going to link this in the DMs or on emails, it's quite an ugly looking link. I get that. You can go to a software like Rebrandly. It's free. You can then connect your domain and then you upload this link and it will just rebrand that with your domain. So for example, instead of it being www.systemizescale.co.uk/social media funnels, 3-step ad launch, UTM source, etc., it could then be systemizescale.co.uk/bio if it's using the bio, for example. So it just allows you to essentially rebrand the long UTM link so it looks a little bit better, but then it still tracks all of that code in the back end for us and allows us to then be very granular with our data. So now that we've got the tracking out of the way and we've got perspective on where calls are coming from, where sales are coming from, and it will allow us to scale this even though we're not taking sales calls, here's the simple system that I would set up in order to leverage myself out of taking sales calls, but still have a bird's eye overview on what's happening in the sales process, and make sure that even though I'm not involved, leads are not being lost, they're still being followed up, and the maximum number of deals are being converted. It is literally impossible to scale your sales if everything relies on your memory. When things are in your memory, they don't happen, it's not scalable. Instead, you need to have this down on a board so that everything is tracked. For example, inside our CRM system, we use pipelines inside our CRM system to track all of this. We have a column for applied leads, for calls that are scheduled, for deals that are won, for leads that no-show, for leads that cancel, people who need manually following up, and then lost leads. Off the back of this, it then allows us to set certain follow-up sequences when leads are moved to each column. For example, if a lead applies, but they haven't booked in a sales call, they then get followed up. If leads book in a call, they then get a nurture sequence before their call. If they cancel their call, they move to cancelled, get followed up, and when they book back in, they move back to scheduled. But then it allows me from a company CEO perspective to then look at this and see where our pipeline is. And if we're seeing that loads of leads are cancelling, well, I can figure out why and I can put a solution in place. But a lot of the time, businesses realize things far later than they should, and ultimately too late in order to fix it. Whereas when you have a pipeline like this, all of the data is there and it's easy to see. However, if you didn't use our platform and you use something like Trello in order to have a pipeline, you can automate this inside Zapier. Inside Zapier, we can then create triggers and actions. Our trigger would be Trello. And then what we could then do is inside Trello, we could then have a step, which is when people are moved to a certain list. When they're then moved to that list, we can then trigger a step afterwards, like Active Campaign, to then, for example, create or update that contact inside Active Campaign to then update their tagging to then trigger a follow-up sequence. So then it means that you can then have the same process in terms of following up with leads at every single point. So you then need less leads because your bucket isn't leaking. Most businesses have a bucket with loads of holes in, they try and spend loads of money on ads and then leads just trickle out. In business, as soon as we find the scalable system, we don't want to have to stop it. We just want to crank the spend up and get aggressive with it. But most businesses can't do that because their business is literally a leaky bucket. When you have a system like this, you then don't have to worry about ever reaching the point where leads are trickling out and you have to pull back on ad spend. You can just keep hammering home ad spend and outperform your competitors because you can outscale them. However, another thing that we can do inside Zapier is we can track all of our calls and inquiries. So let's say we use Typeform for our inquiries, we could then just trigger the Zap when a new entry is submitted. For example, let's say we're using Calendly for calls. We can then trigger when a call is booked, so an invitee is created. We can then trigger this, and what we can then do is we can add a filter step down here, and we can then filter for certain types of calls. So let's say, for example, this is a discovery call, and then let's say this is a maybe it's a two-part close, so it might be a strategy call. We can then filter based off of discovery and then based off of the event type name. So if we connected our Calendly account, we could then choose the event name here. And then what that would then allow us to do is trigger if the event name contains discovery, it goes down here. Under strategy, we could then do the same. So if it contains strategy, we could then trigger if the event name contains strategy, it then goes down here. But we could then go a step further, and if we're building out a big sales team, we might want to trigger certain follow-ups to internal team members based off who's taking calls. So we can then add a path within this, and this path could then split based off certain closers. So we might have a closer called George, we might have a closer called Sarah, we might have a closer called Joe. And what we can then do is we could then say contains George, contains Sarah, and then we could say contains Joe. And what we can then do is if we click here, we will then with Calendly, if we connect our Calendly account, have one called assigned user. And then we can click assigned user, and then it can be if the call is assigned to Joe, it goes down here. If it's assigned to Sarah, if it's assigned to George. What we can then do is we can add a step such as Slack to then notify that team member. And we could then either post this in a channel or we could send it as a DM. And then what that means is we can then, here, direct message, we can then send them a DM. Or if we posted it in a channel, we could post it into a specific channel, but tag that certain team member so they then know the call's been taken, essentially assigned to them to take. We can then also then add them onto our Trello board here from a tracking perspective. So we can then add a step and we could go Trello. And then what we can do is we can then create that card on a Trello board as well. So then that lead's tracked too. So then what we can do is we can start building out the steps in order to essentially streamline that whole process. So then we now know that leads are being tracked, we know where calls are coming from, we know where sales are coming from. We then have the pipelines in place that then when people are moved to certain columns, it triggers the appropriate follow-up sequences. And we could then run that inside a CRM software like ours that replaces a bunch of softwares in your business, or something like Trello where you could connect it through Zapier as well. That will then pull yourself out of the sales process and allow you to then have an overview and see where all of your deals are, where how your pipeline is looking, the amount of money coming through pipeline, where leads are getting stuck, so that you can then put systems in place to then keep moving them through to ultimately getting them to convert. A lot of the time in business, we really don't need more leads, or at least you need far less leads than you actually think if you have the right systems in place in order to move those leads through to ultimately booking in a call with you.